Welcome to Tommy Solo's Famous Friends. This is where I get to chat with people who I've connected with in the world of arts and entertainment over the years, and in this episode we're continuing our conversation with original founding member of April Wine, David Henman, and it's all about rock and roll stories from the bar. And where we left off in part one, David was telling me about his time spent with Bob Cigarini and the Dudes. Now here is David continuing the story.
And I got a phone call from Bob Cigarini, and he said, I'm putting together a kind of a super group. The idea was, he told me who he was talking to. It was my brother Richie. It was Brian Greenway, who would go on to become a guitar player in April Wine later on. And then Wayne, it was a band with 2 drummers, 3 guitar players, and a bass player. And actually, there was a keyboard player originally, but he was a real kind of vanilla kind of character that just didn't fit. I don't even think he made it to the first gig. 6 guys, 2 drummers and 4 guitar players. And my wife at the time, I just told Bob I'd think about it, and hung up the phone, and I turned to my wife and I told her what phone call was all about, and she was like, oh, you have to do this. So we moved back to Montreal to put this band together originally called All the Young Dudes. I think eventually it's shortened to the Dudes.
Right.
And you want to know more about that?
Yeah.
Well, this is what's interesting to me, Tommy, is both April Wine and the Dudes, we got signed right away. And that I regret that, because so many great bands like the Beatles and the Stones had to go through years of struggling, during which time the band members had a time to gel, both musically and as friends. And I regret with both April Wine and with the Dudes that we made it so fast that we really didn't become brothers, if you know what I mean. I mean, we remained friends, especially Bob and I. I mean, boy, Bob and I have a lot of history. And he's right, I don't see enough of the guy because I've moved way up here in the country. He's a city boy. I think he even has a song called City Bread. And I've remained friends with Miles to some degree, and with Jimmy Henman and some of the other members of the various bands that are, at least the ones that are still living, because we're all at that age now. But we just didn't have enough time to gel. You know, when you look at the Rolling Stones, those 4 guys, well, there's 3 of them, 2 of them left, really. But, boy, they had time to really get to know each other, starving and living in a squat or whatever, a flat somewhere, and playing gigs and making no money for years before they were signed. But anyway, to get back to the story of the Dudes, right away we attracted, already Bob, of course, being Bob, he had the ear of people at Rolling Stone magazine and people at Cream magazine. Bob's a media junkie, a self-confessed media junkie. So he's a guy that back in those days, and still to this day probably, spent most of his time in his bathrobe on the telephone, talking to everybody in the music industry. And so right away he was able to drum up interest in the band. I think even before we started performing. Right away we started rehearsing. I don't remember, I have no recollection of a Dude's rehearsal, but that's just my really, really poor memory. I don't remember 90% of my life. So I don't remember any Dude's rehearsals. It just cracks me up. Anyway, we started rehearsing all of these songs right away. I had a bunch of songs that were left over from April Wine that didn't get recorded. Bob, was writing songs like crazy. Brian Greenway was writing songs. And next thing you know, we're getting calls from record companies and we're getting interviews with record companies. And we got interest from Columbia Records, and they were the record company of the day. They had Bob Dylan, and they were the record company. They were huge. And so they sent this producer, Mark Spector, up from New York. He was a staff producer at Columbia Records. And he started working with us, doing pre-production for a CD, for an album. I was going to say a CD. We didn't have CDs back then. And this guy named Fred, all I remember his last name, became our manager. And Fred, the manager, is a character straight out of National Lampoon. He really is, or was. Matter of fact, there are National Lampoon skits about a rock and roll band manager that sounds just like Fred. He was a hot shot, fast talking New York lawyer that wanted to be a band manager. And he was already managing Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Phoebe Snow, Ian Hunter. So and we got to hang out with those guys, which was extremely cool. Got to know Ian Hunter really well. And the guys in Blood, Sweat, and Tears, David
Clayton Thomas.
David Clayton, thank you. But anyway, they got us into the studio at Le Studio Morin Heights up in the Laurentians in Montreal, Andre Perry's old studio there. And we recorded we had been doing demos. We had spent a lot of, well, not a lot of money, but we had spent a lot of time doing demos and building up a lot of debt. And we got a big bonus signing from Columbia Records. When we signed with them, we got a big, I don't know, it was $250,000 or something ridiculous like that. So we rented a limousine and we went around Montreal to all the people that we owed money to, mainly recording studios. And we walked in and we said, "How much do we owe you?" And he said, "Okay, this is how much." And we sat down, wrote them a check. And boy, that was a great experience to go into people's office that you owe money into and say, "Okay, we're here, we got money."
And back then, too, and people that are listening need to realize that this was 1973 or so.
Yeah.
So $250,000 in 1973, that would have to be like $1 million today or something close.
Yeah, oh gosh, yeah. And actually, we had the biggest signing bonus that year for Columbia Records. Now, to cut quickly to the chase, this was all over in a New York minute. We recorded the album. Mark Spector, the producer, really did not know what he was doing. And when we got the finished product back, we got the original pressings back. Remember Brian Greenway and I were both living in the same apartment building. And he called me up and he said, "Can you come over to my place?" So I went over and we sat down and we were listening to the album, the finished album. This was supposed to be, the biggest moment of our lives, and we just hated it. It sounded like it was recorded underwater. I remember when we finished the album, we had a big listening party at the studio. And when they played the finished album for us, they had told us to leave the studio while we mixed it. That was a huge mistake on their part, and a huge mistake on our part to listen to them. But we said, okay, so we all went off, did things while they mixed the album. And then when we went back to the studio to listen to the final mix, they played it at an ungodly loud volume. And nobody could talk. We were just walking around drinking champagne and eating these little sandwiches and whatever else was, provided for this momentous occasion. And, you didn't know what to say. It was so ungodly loud, we couldn't even hear it. And it sounded foreign to us, but, we all hugged and said, "Great job," and off we went. In the following days, as we listened to the album, we all agreed it just sounded horrible. So it's a long, long story. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into.
From what I understand, it was really, really scaled back and the edge was taken off of it. I've also heard that the original demos are still out there.
We actually released the demos a couple of years later. That's another story altogether. But what happened with this album was, we were told, our managers, we protested. Bob Segarini was on the phone cursing Fred out. Fred Heller was his name, the manager.
Editor's note, for the sake of clarity, Fred Heller was the dude's manager who coincidentally also managed Mott the Hoople. Now back to the show.
Cursing him out and saying, also our lawyer was a guy, I'll try and think of his name, but he was Brian Epstein's partner. He was the Beatles lawyer, so he used to we heard great Beatles stories during that period. But anyway, we protested. We said, we hate the album. We want it remixed. And Bob was adamant. He was talking to anybody he would listen to. Andre Perry, Columbia Records, Fred Heller, our management, Mark Spector, the producer, said, we want to remix the album. And they said, no, we're not going to remix the album. They said to us, look, Columbia Records is the biggest record company in the world. They think it's a hit. So what do you guys know? What are you guys going to do? So we said, oh, okay, well, if Columbia Records says it's a hit, we'll, hold our noses and collect the money. So, but basically what happened, as Kim Mitchell describes it, is they basically just threw it against the wall to see if it would stick, and it didn't stick, and that was the end of that, and it was over in a heartbeat. One day we were collecting weekly retainers of $125 each every week, and the next thing you know, the money stopped coming, and we were left kind of hanging. It was funny because the band never officially disbanded. We never got together and said, oh, well, we might as well call it a day. That never happened. We never officially disbanded. We just there was no work, there were no gigs. We were doing our local Montreal shows, but other than that, there were no gigs. We had done a couple of gigs where we opened for Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and we did a shot in New York at the Bottom Line where we opened for Savoy Brown as part of the big push, and then it was all over. Nobody was talking to us, nobody was taking our calls, and it was back to whatever, and it was over. Like I say, about a year or two later, we did meet up with a guy, Toronto record company guy, Peter Burns, I think is his name, and Bob got him to release our demos. There's an album called All the Young Dudes, All the Old Demos, or something along those lines. And it sounds great. It sounds raw and urgent and immediate. But, that was a record. I can't remember the name of that record company, but they weren't a big company, so they weren't able to give the album any kind of major push. And, of course, by that time, we had all gone off. We were all off doing other things. I think by that time, I had actually moved. That was something like 10 years later, if I'm not mistaken. I think by then I had actually moved to Toronto. But that's some of the story. I mean, this really could go on for hours.
Right. Well, this is a typical scenario, though, in the music business when you talk about the guys in suits at Columbia, and I don't know, Frank Zappa said something to the effect of, back in the day, you had a lot of young guys that were actually in music, musicians, whatnot, in A&R, and then all of a sudden it became guys in suits who just felt like they knew everything about something that they actually knew very little about, in fact.
I just finished reading an autobiography by Kenny Jones, the drummer in the Small Faces, and then later Rod Stewart and The Who and so on. And the Small Faces it's a very similar story. It's almost like a universal story. I think just about every band, at least from that era, has similar nightmare stories to tell about.
Well, do you know what Bob Segarini said to me? He says, people keep saying, Bob, where's the book? Come on, where's the book? You got to write a book. And he says, look, just pick up anybody's autobiography from the music business who had their 15 minutes of fame, a star, and insert my name there. Because we all have the same story.
That's a typical brilliant Bob Segarini insight.
Yeah, no kidding. So now, I know pre-pandemic, Brave and Crazy was a going concern. Are there any plans going forward with that once it's safe to go back in the water?
Not for me. I've actually retired from performing, or semi-retired. I don't want to close that door completely. But I'm 73 now. My brain doesn't work quite as efficiently as it used to. I'm a little sketchy about driving. So I pulled the plug earlier this year, probably a couple of months ago. I pulled the plug on going out on the road kind of thing. Like I say, the door is not closed. Tomorrow's a brand new day. But for the moment, the idea for me of going out, and as much as Brave and Crazy is, I'm one of the original 4 members of that band. We're like family. The girls in that band taught me more about love and loyalty and friendship than you could possibly imagine. They are the most amazing people to be on a stage with. Sam and Susie, I have never seen them in 20 years or 22 years with those people at rehearsals and at shows. I have never seen them give anything less than 1,000%. It's been just an amazing experience. So it broke my heart to give my notice. But again, the door is not completely closed. You know, who knows what. Part of it is I can't really justify going out, you know, for these long drives and so on and so forth to play cover songs. And Brave and Crazy is a cover band. If that ever changes, that could create another chapter in the story. And I'm encouraging that and looking for ways to encourage it more.
When you talk about the driving, you know, that was a thing for me when I was in my 20s. Driving from Toronto to Thunder Bay, you know, leaving on the Saturday night at like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning by the time we tore down our gear and loaded it into the van, you know, and having to go to Thunder Bay, a 15, 16-hour drive, you know, and get there in time so you could do your sound check on the Sunday afternoon before the dinner crowd came in, you know, and all that. I mean, the driving has always been a thing, and that's really one of the reasons that I quit playing the bars myself a number of years ago. So I think that what really works for guys like you and me is to play where you know it's going to be fun, and if you're not sure, then why bother? Because if the people aren't there for the music, right, what are you doing it for?
Yeah, and, you know, it gets tough because back in the day, of course, we had road crews. We had, you know, in April Wine, when you showed up for the gig, your equipment was already on stage, already set up, your guitars were tuned, and so on and so forth. I don't mean to sound entitled, but where that becomes an issue is when you're 73 and you show up at a bar, there's a band already on stage, and when they get off stage, you've got to wait while they take their gear off stage. Then you've got to, you know, you're standing in the hallway of a crowded bar, you know, guarding your amplifiers and guitars. And then the band gets off stage, and you got to run up there, get your gear up there, get it set up, get the PA set up, and everything. You've got basically an hour, maybe 45 minutes, maybe 30 minutes to get all that together. Then you've got to do your sound check in front of the audience.
I talked to Robert Swartz from the band Lynx, and his story was a little bit like April Wine and the Dudes in that they were signed at a very young age. And I mean, they were still in high school when they were signed to their record deal. And so they, with Lynx, everywhere they went, they had a road crew, they had everything set up, and like you say, walk on stage and play your guitar and then go home. And then after their second or third album, all of a sudden they didn't have a road crew, and he said, man, this is hard. This is a hard job. And again, this is when he was in his 20s, and I felt the same when I was like 25, 26. I thought, like, why am I doing this? Driving across Canada, you know, and doing all this work. But, you know, I think we have the music, we love the music will always be part of us, and that's what makes life worth living for me. Music is the doctor.
And, you know, part of this comes from the pandemic. During this lockdown, I discovered that this whole world of collaborating remotely with other songwriters and other players. And next thing you know, the last couple of years, I've been busier than I've ever been. You know, there's no money in it, but I mean, there was no money in it back when I started. So there's no difference. There's no difference there.
Full circle. And, you know, we're still playing on average for $100 a night. And that's what we were getting paid in the 1980s, right?
That's right. And that's because it's a young man's game. You know, I think you're hitting your 60s now. I'm in my 70s. We really don't matter anymore, Tom.
I had this conversation with Henry Small.
Really?
Yeah.
I saw him with the Smalls way back in the very early 70s, and we were blown away.
Yeah, I mean he's an amazing singer, and
Yeah.
when I talked to him and did the actual first interview, we talked about, damned if you do, damned if you don't, because he was given the job to replace Ron Tabak, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name right, but in prison.
Yeah.
And Ron Tabak has such a unique, earthy, raw rock and roll voice. And Henry's got such a clean, powerful, full range that, I mean, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Now, he was on their biggest selling album, but nobody in Canada really got it. So, man, rock and roll, what can you do? Well, listen, David, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to do this with me. And, we'll have to get together before too long, and Rose and you and Lisa and I, and see if we can't sit around and tell a few more lies.
That would be great. I love doing that.
Yeah.
I love doing it.
I thank you so much. And the last time we saw each other face to face was really a momentous occasion. And, shortly after that, we lost Greg Simpson.
Yeah.
And shortly after that, we lost Tommy Alcatraz, the photographer. So Rockin' for Kids 2020 was really an important show for us. I'm just so glad that we had the occasion to do that. But anyway, David, I'm going to let you have the rest of your day, and thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure, Tommy. Thank you.
Well, cheers.
All right, you too.
Well, it's always a blast for me when I have the chance to talk to David Henman, and I do hope that we have a chance before too long to do some more musical collaboration with each other. Meanwhile, here is Henman Rose, and It Ain't Over Yet. Enjoy.
Back in '89 when the wall come tumbling down.
Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a one-man production, meaning that I've done all the work, including producing, editing, guest acquisition, etc. All rights reserved. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The theme song for Tommy Solo's Famous Friends was written and recorded by Tommy Solo with a little help from my friends in the night crew. And hey, if you like the show, why not subscribe? Until next time, cheers.